The courtroom smelled like old carpet and someone's burnt coffee, and I kept thinking that was a strange detail to notice when my entire life was sitting on a table 20 feet away from me in a manila folder. My brother sat across the aisle. He had on a new blazer, the kind you buy specifically for occasions like this, stiff at the shoulders, the tag probably still scratched against his neck. He looked confident. That was always his thing. He could walk into any room like he'd already won whatever was happening inside it. I was 31 years old, sitting in a courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, with a real estate lawyer named Hutchins who charged more per hour than I made in a week at my old job, and I was trying very hard not to let my hands shake. My brother's lawyer, a guy with an aggressively unfortunate comb-over named Prentice, stood up first. He smoothed his lapels and addressed the judge with the kind of practiced gravity that is supposed to make you feel like you're watching something important. "Your Honor," he said, "my client is here to assert his rightful claim to the full estate of the late Evelyn Sutherland, including the family home, the savings accounts, and all associated property. He contends that the will presented by the respondent was obtained under undue influence." Undue influence. I had to say that phrase to myself a few times before it stopped sounding absurd, as if I'd manipulated my dying mother into changing her will. As if I had that kind of power over anyone, let alone a woman who once made a contractor cry for not caulking her bathroom tile correctly. The judge, a woman in her late 50s named Caldwell, no-nonsense gray hair and reading glasses she wore like a professor, looked up from the folder in front of her. And the respondent. My lawyer Hutchins stood. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to demonstrate that the will is entirely valid, that Mrs. Sutherland was of sound mind and full legal capacity, and that the changes she made to her estate documents were her own decision, documented and witnessed accordingly." I looked at my brother. He was already looking at me, and he gave me this slow little smile. The kind that said, "You don't know what I have, and I can't wait for you to find out." I knew that smile. I'd been watching it my whole life. He used it when he thought he was holding something over me, and usually he was right. Not today. "My name is Ivy Sutherland. I'm 31, I work in home health care, and until 18 months ago, I was my mother's full-time caregiver. Not because I was ordered to, not because anyone asked, because when my mother got her diagnosis, early onset Parkinson's, followed 2 years later by a small stroke that took some of her mobility, I was the one who showed up. My brother, Cade, lived 40 minutes away. He might as well have lived in another country. I want to tell you what that looks like, because people hear caregiver and they picture something soft. They picture someone sitting beside a bed holding a hand, maybe reading aloud. That's not what it is. It's a 5047 a.m. alarm because your mother's medication window is 6,000, and if she misses it, the tremors start. It's spending 40 minutes on hold with an insurance company to fight a claim they denied twice already. It's learning how to transfer someone from a wheelchair to a shower chair without either of you getting hurt, because you can't always afford the aid, and even when you can, they sometimes cancel. It's eating cold food because you only remembered to feed yourself after you'd finished feeding her. It's sitting in a hospital parking garage at midnight while the doctors run tests and calling your brother to let him know and hearing him say, "Keep me posted," like you're giving him a weather update. I don't say any of this for sympathy. I say it because it matters. It matters when my brother stood in that courtroom and said he was being treated unfairly. Cade was the one who got the full college fund. He was the one Mom talked about at every holiday table like he was one press release away from being famous. He had a good-looking life, decent job in commercial real estate, a house in the suburbs, a wife who wore the kind of white sneakers that cost $200 and always looked clean. He sent Mom flowers on Mother's Day, he called on her birthday. He showed up for Easter and Christmas, ate her cooking, watched football in the living room, and left. He was not there the other 353 days of the year. I never said anything about that, not once. I drove the 40 minutes to his house once, 2 years into my mother's illness, and I sat at his kitchen table and I told him I needed help. I said I couldn't keep doing this alone, that I was burning out, that even 1 or 2 weekdays a month would make a difference. He nodded like he was in a meeting. He said he'd figure something out. He never did. A few months before my mother died, she asked to meet with her attorney alone. I drove her there, waited in the parking lot, and drove her home. She didn't tell me what was discussed, and I didn't ask. That wasn't unusual. She was a private person. She had a way of keeping her business. Her business, which I respected even when it frustrated me. She passed in March. The funeral was quiet. Cade gave a short eulogy that was mostly about him. He talked about things she taught him, lessons from childhood, her cooking, her laugh, all true things, all curated things, the kind of tribute that sounds complete but leaves out everything inconvenient. It was at the will reading that he found out. The house went to me. The savings went to me. A smaller account, enough to be meaningful, not enough to be life-changing, was set aside for him, with a note from my mother written in her own handwriting that said she loved him, that she was proud of him, and that she was proud of him, and that she hoped he understood. He did not understand. Within 3 weeks, he'd hired Prentice. The lawsuit alleged that I had isolated my mother during her illness, controlling her access to outside contact, and had used that position to manipulate her end-of-life documents. Every word of it was false, every single word, but it was written convincingly, and when I read it the first time alone in my apartment, I had to put it down and walk to the kitchen and stand at the sink for a while before I could pick it back up. Because that's what it's like to be accused of something by someone who knows exactly where to aim. He knew my vulnerabilities. He knew I'd spent years second-guessing myself, wondering if I was doing enough, wondering if I was doing it right. He took that uncertainty and he made it into a legal document. My lawyer Hutchins was calm when he called me. "This is common," he said. "Contested wills are contested all the time by people who feel entitled. It doesn't mean they win. It means they file paperwork." "He's my brother," I said. Hutchins paused. "I know, but right now he's also the opposing party. Keep those two things separate." I did my best. The weeks before the hearing were the strangest of my life. I was still working. I couldn't afford not to, and I was spending evenings at Hutchins' office going through boxes of documentation he'd requested. Medical records, pharmacy logs, her physical therapy notes, my own text messages and call logs going back 2 years, even receipts from grocery runs I'd made for her. Every piece of evidence that I had been present, that I had not isolated her, that other people had been in and out of that house constantly. Her friend Dorothea, who came every Tuesday for years, her physical therapist who visited twice a week, the aide we had on Fridays, the neighbor girl who shoveled the driveway in winter without being asked. We contacted them all. Every one of them agreed to provide a statement. Cade's side had a theory. They didn't have witnesses. There was one other thing Hutchins had, and that was the thing neither Cade nor Prentice knew about. My mother had been thorough in a way that, honestly, I hadn't fully understood until after she was gone. About 8 months before she died, she had done something I only learned about when Hutchins pulled a document from his file and slid it across the desk to me. She had recorded a video. Not a dramatic confession. Not a production. She'd sat in her living room chair, the one by the window that got the afternoon light, the one she said made her feel like she was sitting in a painting, and she had spoken into a phone camera that her attorney had set up. She was fully herself. Shaky hands, yes. Slower speech than she used to have, but clear as anything. She said she had updated her documents freely and without any pressure from me or anyone else. She said she understood what she was doing. She said she had thought about it carefully and she wanted it on the record that Ivy had given up more than any child should have to, and that she wanted the record to show this wasn't favoritism. It was fairness. She said Cade was her son and she loved him. She said she also knew what these years had cost me, and that love, in her understanding, was not separate from action. Then she said something I had to ask Hutchins to pause the playback for because I needed a second. She said, "I know Cade will probably fight this. He always fights things he doesn't want to accept. Tell him I said the hard part of being a parent is knowing who your kids really are and loving them anyway. Tell him his sister knew how to show up. I needed someone who knew how to show up. I don't know when she did this without my knowledge. I don't know how she arranged it. But my mother had been planning that long, which meant she'd seen this coming before I did." In the courtroom, Cade's performance was polished. I'll give him that. He sat just slightly turned toward the gallery, the way people do when they want to remind the room they're being watched sympathetically. His voice cracked at the exact right moments. He talked about missing his mother's final months because he wasn't allowed to visit freely, which was not only false but was contradicted by 17 separate text messages between him and me specifically inviting him to come, more than half of which he either ignored or declined. Prentice played up the narrative, loving son, kept at a distance by a controlling sibling who had inserted herself as gatekeeper. It was neat and it was wrong, and I sat through it with my jaw clenched and my hands flat on the table, the way Hutchins had coached me. "Don't react," he'd told me. "Judges read the defendant. If she sees you roll your eyes, she's writing that down." When it was my turn, I didn't perform. I answered questions the way you answer questions when you already know the truth is enough. I explained my mother's care schedule. I explained the documentation. I explained how many people had access to her during those years, how many calls she made independently, how she had attended her own doctor's appointments. I pulled out the pharmacy records that showed her medications were never missed. I spoke about the nights I slept on her couch because her nighttime symptoms had gotten worse and I didn't want her to fall. Prentice cross-examined me. He tried to make my presence sound sinister. He asked why I had been at the house so often. I told him because my mother needed someone there that often. He asked why I'd been the one to drive her to her attorney. I told him because she couldn't drive anymore and he had not offered. That one landed. I watched Judge Caldwell make a note. Then Hutchins stood up and said, "Your Honor, I have one additional piece of evidence I'd like to submit for the record." He walked a USB drive to the bailiff. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered on, and there was my mother in her chair in the afternoon light. I had already seen it twice in Hutchins' office. I still had to look away from the screen when she spoke, not because it was painful in the way you'd expect. It was something else. It was the feeling of being seen by someone who was no longer there to see you. The courtroom was very quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear the ventilation system. Cade stopped performing. I watched it happen in real time. The careful posture crumbled a little. His hands, which had been loose and confident on the table, went still. When my mother said his name, when she said tell him his sister knew how to show up, he turned away from the screen. When the video finished, Judge Caldwell removed her reading glasses and held them in one hand for a moment. She looked at Prentice. "Counselor, does your client have evidence to contest the validity of this recording or the decedent's capacity at the time it was made?" Prentice shuffled some papers. "Your Honor, we would need time to review." "You've had discovery," she said. "This recording was submitted through proper legal channels by the estate's attorney months ago. You had access to it." Prentice had no clean answer, because the truth was they'd probably known about it and had gambled that the rest of their case would be strong enough to work around it. It wasn't. Judge Caldwell set her glasses down on the bench and looked at my brother directly. Not at his lawyer. At Cade. "Mr. Sutherland," she said, "this court has reviewed the will, the supporting documentation, the witness statements, and this recording. The decedent clearly expresses her wishes, her reasoning, and her state of mind. There is no legal basis presented here to overturn a validly executed document, simply because the beneficiary is dissatisfied with the outcome. The estate will be distributed as written." Cade's chair scraped back slightly. He didn't stand. He just sat there looking like someone had turned a light off in him. His wife, who had come to watch and sat in the second row in a pressed blazer of her own, gathered her bag and looked at the floor. Prentice started collecting his folders. Outside, reporters who had picked up on the story, because apparently an estranged son suing his caregiving sister is exactly the kind of thing local news loves, waited near the entrance. Hutchins walked out beside me and said one sentence to them. "The court has ruled. The estate is distributed per Mrs. Sutherland's instructions." Then we kept walking. Cade didn't speak to me in the hall. I didn't speak to him either. I'd thought I would feel something big in that moment. Relief maybe, or vindication, or some satisfying version of justice landing exactly where it should. What I actually felt was tired. The good kind of tired, if that makes sense. The kind that comes after something hard is finally over. In the weeks that followed, I got the call from Hutchins confirming the transfer of assets. I sold the savings bonds she'd held for decades, kept the ones she'd specifically earmarked for reinvestment, and kept the house. The house was the part that surprised people. Everyone assumed I'd sell it. It was a 3-bedroom in a neighborhood that had appreciated significantly, and the practical move was obvious. I didn't sell it, I moved back in. Not out of sentiment alone, though some of that was there. I moved back in because I'd spent 2 years in that house keeping it running, and it felt like mine in a way that had nothing to do with the deed. Every repaired hinge and patched wall and rearranged piece of furniture was a decision I'd made with my own hands. She and I had argued about the kitchen paint color for months, until we agreed on a warm cream that neither of us loved, and both of us lived with peacefully. That paint was still on the walls. I wasn't ready to let someone else paint over it. I also did something else. With a portion of what I inherited, I set up a small fund through a local nonprofit. Nothing elaborate. The organization already existed. They provided respite care for family caregivers who couldn't afford professional coverage. I wrote a check and told them to use it however they needed. The woman on the phone thanked me and asked if I wanted to be listed as a donor. I said I'd rather not. My mother would have found a way to say she approved without actually saying it, probably by making me a cup of coffee and putting a little too much sugar in it, which was her version of affection disguised as an accident. Kate filed a motion to reconsider. It was denied. After that, silence. He and I haven't spoken since the courtroom. I don't know if we ever will. I've turned that over enough times now that I've stopped expecting an answer. Some things don't resolve the way you want them to. Some distances stay distances. I don't hate him for it. I don't carry it around the way I used to. But I'm also not going to pretend the last 3 years didn't teach me something about who shows up and who explains why they couldn't. My mother knew. She'd always known. She watched both of us our whole lives, and she drew her conclusions without ever making a speech about it. She just waited until she had a camera and an attorney and an afternoon with enough light, and then she said everything she needed to say. I think about that sometimes when I drive past the attorney's office, or when I sit in the chair by the window on a Sunday afternoon. She didn't fight for me dramatically. She didn't leave me a letter that would make anyone cry at a reading. She sat in her chair, looked at a camera, and told the truth plainly. That's the most her thing she ever did. And in a courtroom full of performance and strategy and lawyers adjusting their papers importantly, it was the quietest thing in the room, and also the loudest. I keep coming back to the chair by the window, the one my mother sat in when she recorded that video. On Sunday afternoons, when the light hits it the same way it must have hit her that day, I sit there and I think about how quietly she made her decision. No drama, no warning. Just a woman who had watched 2 people her whole life and knew exactly what she was seeing. That's the part people don't talk about when they talk about stories like this. They want the courtroom moment. They want the brother's face when the screen came on. And I understand that it is satisfying in the way that truth landing where it belongs is always satisfying. But what actually stays with me is the years before, the 1,000 small choices that led to that room. I didn't take care of my mother because I thought it would pay off someday. I want to be clear about that. I showed up at 5:47 in the morning because she needed someone there at 5:47 in the morning, and I was the one who could be there. That's it. There was no calculation behind it. If anything, the years I spent doing it taught me that the people who do things out of calculation are terrible at hiding it, and eventually everyone around them figures it out, including the person they think they're fooling. Cade was smart in a lot of ways. He knew how to present himself. He knew how to walk into a room and take up exactly the right amount of space. What he never learned, and I think this is what ultimately cost him everything, was the difference between appearing trustworthy and actually being trustworthy. Those 2 things can look identical for a long time, but they're not the same, and in the end, the gap between them is where everything falls apart. My mother knew. She'd been watching that gap for decades. What I understand now, sitting on the other side of all of it, is that the life you build out of genuine effort has a kind of structural integrity that shortcuts don't. It holds up when someone pushes against it. Every record Hutchins pulled, every statement from the physical therapist, every text message I'd sent, Cade trying to get him to come, all of it existed not because I'd been building a case. It existed because I'd been living honestly. The documentation was just evidence of a real life. You can't manufacture that retroactively. There's something uncomfortable in that too, because it means the reverse is also true. Cade didn't lose because of bad luck or a clever lawyer or a USB drive. He lost because of years of choices. Every time he said he'd figure something out and didn't. Every time he let a phone call go to voicemail. Every time he showed up for the holiday and not for the hard week in between. Those things accumulated into a record just as real as mine, just less flattering. I'm not telling you this to be harsh about him. I genuinely don't know what he told himself during those years. People are very good at building explanations for their own absence. But the courtroom didn't care about his explanation. It cared about what actually happened. And what actually happened was written clearly enough that a judge could read it in an afternoon. My mother used to say that people show you who they are if you watch long enough and stop making excuses for what you see. She said it casually, the way she said most of the things that turned out to matter. I didn't write it down. I should have written it down. The fund I set up isn't named after her. She would have found that embarrassing. It just does what it does quietly. Helps people who are in the middle of the years I was in, the ones where there's no courtroom and no resolution yet. Just a 5,047 alarm and a full day ahead. That feels like the right thing to do with what she left me. Not the money, the understanding.